All right. Thanks for joining me again in our class, The Bible is History. Today we want to talk a little bit about historical sources and about bias. We're getting ready to read the text itself, and we're on our way with studying Israel and her neighbors. But I do want to point this out because I think it's important along the way to be able to recognize bias in historical presentations. So there are three types of historical sources that we use in terms of literature to understand what happened. The first one, and I think the most reliable and the most interesting, are primary sources. Those are letters and books and seals and other artifacts that are created or used by the actors in history. So we have George Washington's diary. We have Columbus's annals. We have the writings of others who have acted in history. One biblical example is Daniel chapter 4, when Nebuchadnezzar tells us about the time that God judged him in order to help him to come to a understanding of who the God of Israel really is. So that's a primary source. The advantage of a primary source is that they come closest to the actors in history because they themselves are creating them. So primary sources are the letters, the documents, the marriage licenses, the death certificates, all the things that are created, the deeds to property. All of those things are primary sources. There's an example of a primary source in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Chapter 15 is the resurrection chapter, and Paul says the resurrection took place and Jesus was seen by over 500 brothers after the resurrection, many of whom are still alive. Paul's point is, if you're not sure that Christ is raised from the dead, there are people who have seen him. Go ask them, they're still alive. See, it's sort of evidence against the idea that the resurrection could be a myth or a legend. There hasn't been enough time between the historical events and the reimagining of those historical events to make them into the kind of myth or legend that we might expect. Paul intends that. He intends to say the whole of Christianity is based on this historical event, which is the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, you see? So primary sources are incredibly invaluable, and I think they're also the most fun. I have a great letter that William Penn wrote as he's getting ready to take a trip back in the time when it was dangerous to take a trip and you weren't sure you were going to be coming back. And so it's a letter that he writes to his family, instructions for his wife and for his children, and for their welfare. He's taking care of them, financially and otherwise, in case he's unable to return. That kind of letter just kind of moves you. It's the details of history that excite us, and primary sources are chock full of them. Secondary sources are a little bit different. These are historians that are writing outside of the events of history, but they're close. They are within a generation or two to the times which they record. So I think of a book like The 12 Caesars, in which Suetonius describes each of the emperors of the Roman Empire in turn. He's a secondary source. So in some of those cases, he was not there. He didn't personally participate in the events of that Caesar, but he did have much more access to their annals, to their writings, to perspective than you and I do. So if I'm writing about Tiberius, I'm going to know a lot less than somebody who lived within a generation or two, wasn't involved in the events, didn't know the people perhaps personally, but has much better access to contemporary sources, to knowing how people want to remember him within a generation or two, rather than us trying to figure it out today, where we have centuries and millennia separating us from them. You see, so primary sources are by the times, by the actors in those times, and secondary sources are right after that, where lots of evidence that will later get lost was available to them. And then the third kind of source is called a tertiary source. Tertiary sources are sources that are removed from the historical events. They're really more contemporary to us, like a textbook. Textbooks, in my mind, they drum all the fun out of history because you learn times, places, people, and events, but you don't know what they thought. You don't know what they thought as they accomplished the things that they set out to do. So textbooks' advantage is their gathering principle. Out of all the things that happened historically, what are the things most worthy to be remembered? And so you get that teacher's perspective, so they can gather, but the perspective is only as good as the gatherer, only as good as the historian can give. And the disadvantage then is that these documents, the tertiary ones, your textbook, they're the most prone to manipulation by the author's bias. For example, I was interested in buying a set of videos on the Middle Ages, and I was able to find them, and I got them, and I was pretty excited about learning about the major events and the people of the medieval period. And right in the first lecture, the teacher says, we're not going to worry about the major movers and shakers of the Middle Ages. We're going to go and study what life is like for the milkmaid. We're going to go study what life is like for the person in the marketplace. We're not concerned about what's happening in the church. We're not concerned about what's happening in politics. We want to know what life was like for those people whose daily work wrestled with things like the plague, wrestled with things like Black Death as it moved over Europe. You see, the author has a conscious decision to leave out tons of useful information and give us the information he deems as important. So it's a really good idea when it's really good, and it's a really bad idea when he's leaving out things that would be useful to know for a more accurate picture of history. So the fact that they have that long-term view is good, but how they select what they want to tell and what they reject from telling tells us more about the author today than how history really was. Do you see my point? So we have primary sources that are the peoples and actors in the time. It is their journals, their writings, their letters. Secondary sources are right after that, where they have access to a lot of those things, but the writer wasn't personally involved. And then tertiary sources is that long-term look of somebody contemporary with us beginning to write a history of the ancient world using what they can, but oftentimes inserting a level of bias that we need to be aware of. So the author has a gathering principle. Why did the historian keep what he kept, and why did he not share something else? So with primary sources, you get what you find, usually. So you're excited every time you find anything that's written in George Washington's handwriting, right? Or has the imprint or seal of a Hezekiah. So primary sources, you get what you find and you're excited and you're trying to put that into the puzzle. Secondary sources have a tendency to glorify the individual or the event, thinking about some of the ways in which historical figures in the medieval world over generations took on almost godlike qualities by the people who told their stories after them. So they have a tendency to glorify the individual or the event that happened. Primary sources, secondary sources, and tertiary sources really display the author's intent. And so you're getting from them what they believe drives history. What is it, power or wealth or religion? And again, sometimes tertiary sources have lots of names and dates and events, but they took all the color out of it. So there we are. Those are the three sources and how bias sometimes comes into play. One of the experiments that I like to do with my students sometimes is I will give them 3 copies of ways in which different articles, different textbooks, tertiary sources dealt with Martin Luther. I'll give them a copy of a page out of a Protestant history text. I'll give them a page out of The Power and the Glory, Catholic history text, and then I'll give them a public school history text. Now just think for a minute, how would each of those work out? What would they say about Martin Luther? You can expect the most accolades to be given by the Protestant history text, right? He is the founding leader of the Protestant movement, and so you would expect most of the good things to be said in the Protestant history text. The Power and the Glory that I mentioned earlier, the Catholic history text, you can tell that Martin Luther is much more problematic. His things are said about his parents, things are said about, and Martin Luther did have some issues. So those things play much more of a role in the Catholic history text than they did in the Protestant history text. You almost think they're not talking about the same person. And then if that's not enough, what if you can't talk about religion necessarily? Because Martin Luther was primarily and ultimately a theologian who wanted to purify the church and to get it back to what Scripture taught. And so if you are a public school history text and you don't really want to start talking about views of the Lord's table or views of baptism or views of what needs to be purified in the church, you might end up saying something like, in the article that I had said, Martin Luther did a lot in caring for the poor. See, which he did, but do you see how we're getting truncated in all three cases? We're getting truncated pictures of who Martin Luther really was. The corrective for all of that is to read what he wrote, to read what contemporaries wrote about him, to read the letters, to read the debates, because all of that will give us a much clearer picture of who Martin Luther was, instead of a glorified Luther in a Protestant history text, a vilified Luther in a Catholic history text, or a secularized Luther in a public school history text. You see the issue? Using primary sources helps to cut through the bias to the truth of history. So that's where we want to get, right? We don't want our search in history to turn out to be a mirror of who we are. We want to learn from it, and to do that, we have to get as close to what is accurate and true about what happened in the past and who the people were who acted in the past. That is our best opportunity to understand and to adjust our lives to learn what is important from history. All right, thanks for hanging out.